Survival is a privilege which entails obligations. I'm forever asking myself, what can I do for those who have not survived? The answer I have found for myself, and which need not necessarily be the answer for every survivor, is I want to be their mouthpiece. I want to keep their memory alive to make sure the dead live on in that memory.
My name is Wartski, but born Kaufman, Kaufman. It's like double N, that's right. He says double N, so Kaufman. And that was sort of German name. And that's I was from Hungary, Ungvar. That's where I came from.
Okay. My name is Heinz Wartski, and I was born in Danzig, actually, essentially Germany.
We were living in this town, Ungvar, was a lovely town near the Carpathian Mountain, beautiful place. But I was going to school, and nobody was no problem there. We had no problem until the last. I think it was when the Nazis occupied. Yeah. They came around and they told us certain things we had to do. They made us put yellow stars on my dress, and we couldn't talk to then they started saying we can't go back to school anymore. That's how it really began.
Well, for myself, I think it was very early on when the Nazis came to power, essentially, in Germany. That was in 1933. In January 1933, they were quick to separate us from the rest of society, as far as that goes. So that was 33. I was 4 years old, and so it was. I grew up essentially with that separation in existence. One of the points that is very clear, because many things happened that time, was what is called Kristallnacht, which meant the night of the broken glass. That's when the Nazis broke into Jewish stores, they broke the glass in Jewish homes and so forth. So they did that. So that was it happened in November, early part of November 1938. And they also, at that time, they arrested many Jews and sent them to concentration camps. Included in that was my father. He was arrested and sent to his concentration camp.
Well, when they occupied our town, Ungvar, we were not allowed to go to school anymore. One day they just came and told us they're going to take us away. And we ended up in a factory yard that had a tent. And that's where we were, in that tent. Couple of weeks, I don't remember exactly how long, but we were there, and before going to the railroad station there, and with the boxcars and all, we waited. More and more people they brought into this tent. And so then when they had enough, they took us away. We walked, you walk to the railroad, to the boxcars.
30 feet long by 8 feet wide. These were the standard dimensions for a boxcar used to transport countless victims to their death. The atrocious living conditions were endured for days on end. Each car packed 100 or more people, with no room to sit or lay down, uncertain of their final destination. The re-education of citizens through hard labor was common practice throughout the war. Millions toiled against their will to improve the very war machine that enslaved them. Whether working in factories or exposed to the elements, each human struggled to survive another day, laboring at gunpoint.
Now, 6 months later, this in May 1939, still before the war, he came home and he learned a lesson. And he said, well, you know, these people are going to kill us. We know what they're going to do. Again, this contrast to what they didn't have that education, okay? So we had all this education. In addition to, the Nazis in Germany were singing all sorts of songs about how they're going to kill us, you know. They're going to sharpen their long knives, you know, and it's pretty gory type of activities that they were going to practice. But anyway, so we had... But it was piling up, you know, maybe, you know, it's going to happen. This is what they're going to do. So anyway, he said, we're going to have to leave Germany. We have to get out of here and try to find a place to go to, a country. Now, there was a problem. In the meantime, they had enacted number of anti-Jewish laws. They call them the Nuremberg laws, okay, and that's what under which the Jews, if they left Germany, they could not take any possessions or any monies with them. Very few clothing, pieces of clothing, very little. You know, one little suitcase per person. You know, maybe a medium-sized suitcase, whatever. Anyway, so that's essential. Now, the problem was, what country would allow people to come in who are destitute? Each country, most countries, had enough destitute people of their own. They didn't need us to come in and be a burden on the society. So essentially, that was the problem. Now, how on earth can you get out if nobody will let you in? So my father was thinking about it and said, okay, why don't we do this? And maybe we went to many delegations, foreign delegations. One of the delegations he went to was the Italian delegations, and he found out that Italians were not anti-Semitic at all. Although Mussolini was allied with Hitler, the Italians did not practice anti-Semitism. So he thought, well, why don't we do this here and do this in 2 steps? We get some false papers to some country or wherever it is, and South America or what have you, and then get a transit visa through Italy, because at that time the war had already started and no overseas transit was going on between Germany and South America or any of the rest of the world. So that's why we could use Italy as a transit going through. So that was not a hard thing to do, to get a transit visa, as long as they know that you're not going to stay there. But anyway, so we managed to buy some false papers, good papers actually, falsified with our names. That time you had to do, the falsification had to be very good, because the Nazis were not dumb. That's one thing, they knew how to examine papers. So anyway, at that time, most countries knew how to examine paper. Now it's different.
The light was often described as blinding as the heavy wooden doors were slung open. Sunlight or spotlight, the unending wave of victims seemed to never cease. Huddled in a dark train for days, prisoners arriving at Auschwitz were plied with promises of food and shelter. The horrific sorting began immediately after deportation, as Jews were organized by gender and physical fitness. Families were separated, not knowing that for many, this would be their final moment together.
Well, what you do is, but before we even got into our barrack, you know, they make you take off your clothes. I was stark naked. They shaved my head. After they shaved it, they made us go in under the shower. And that's how, you know, I got a uniform. And I put the uniform on. And I went into the barracks. And this guy sat at a table. He was also a concentration camp inmate.
Yeah.
And he said to me, sit over here. And he had kind of an ink, a pen, you know. He dipped into the ink, this pen, and he started putting numbers on my hand, you see. And there it was, 21760. I had this, and every time he put the needle in there, you know, I started pulling back. Wow. Damn it, it hurts so, you know. So the A, which is supposed to be Auschwitz, never came up because I just couldn't, but slowly, I, you know, they put that number on my hand. Inside the barrack, there were these bunks, 3-tier bunks. And my older sister said, let's take the top. They won't see us that way, you know, and sure enough, I listened to my older sister because she knew what she was talking about. And we went up to the, after he put the number, I went up to we went up, all three of us. But my older sister said, do not tell them that we are related. Do not tell them anything. We are together. But remember, I have always such a big mouth, I always talk, you know. So, but I listened to my sister. Then she said, don't say anything that you are sisters, or that you are twins, or anything like that, you know. Because they're gonna separate you for sure. So for 6 months, nobody knew.
Joining nearly 200,000 Italian resistance fighters, the Wartski family struggled to survive in a hostile environment each day. By 1944, 1/3 of the German army stationed in Italy were fighting a guerrilla war against partisans and refugees that had banded together.
At that time, we were, let me see now, we came down from the mountains,
because we were attacked a few times, so we were came out of the mountains, some of us anyway, and we were running around. The reason we got out of the mountains was because this was an area of farming area, you know, where we were not too far from the mountains, between the Apennines and the Adriatic. In central Italy, that's all farming areas. And so the reason we wanted to get out of the mountains too, because we needed food, okay? And so the farmers, they gave us food. They were very nice to us. The reason they were nice is that many of their sons and relatives were also in the mountains with us in order to avoid being sent to Germany to work. They sent a lot of people from all over Europe. The Germans, all occupied areas, they sent people to Germany to work because they had a scarcity of labor. And so some of the Italian young people were rounded up to fight and to conscript it by the new fascist regime. It was called a new fascist regime. The old fascist regime fell and it was overthrown by, and so the new fascist regime was then established, and so they avoided doing that also. They didn't want to fight for Germany. They mistrusted each other. We were benefiting from this relationship, or we as refugees running from the German occupiers and avoiding to be sent to a concentration camp, because that's the first thing they did. Whenever they occupied a country, they would round up the Jews. That was their first mission, and then the first thing they would do, send us to a German concentration camp, and that was even more difficult than for the Hungarians to be sent to a concentration camp in like Auschwitz. The Hungarian Jews, they understood Yiddish because they were under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were allied with Austria. So I don't know if you whatever you want to us. Yeah, no, you want. Yeah, you guys understood German.
Oh yeah.
So that's why they understood when orders were shouted to them, and they could act accordingly.
Every day, same thing. They marched us out, and they counted us. Where the heck are we going, for heaven's sakes? Mm-hmm. All these cables and all these wires around us. You couldn't go anywhere anyway. But they still then marched us in, and this guy came and brought us some black coffee with a piece of black bread. That was our breakfast. For lunch, I don't know, water-down soup, I think, and same thing for supper. It was a water-down kind of soup, And that's how it went. For 6 months, back again, counting us. It was just unreal, it was so. But I said and I was the youngest, and I said to my sisters, I'm going to survive this. I will, because I want to tell what they're doing to us. And for 6 months, that's how we were. We were waiting, because evidently they needed people to work in a slave labor, and so they wanted us, waiting to see if we had to go, And that's how we were for 6 months. So then one day, in came these SS. They were SS, Nazis. They had the Hakenkreuz right there on their lapel, so you know that they were SS. And they counted 50 girls. We were so quiet. We were hoping They did. They counted my sister and myself and the 50 girls. They marched us out, and the truck was there waiting for us. Mm-hmm. We didn't know what happened, where they're going to take us or what's going to happen. But the truck was all covered. It was an open truck, but they covered it so we wouldn't know where we're going. So, my sisters and I said, oh God, maybe they're taking us and they're going to kill us. Yeah. And after a while, my older sister said to me, I think we are out of Auschwitz, because it was quite a ways, And it wasn't so smelling, because the gas chambers and the crematorium, the smell was so unbelievable, from bodies and whatnot. Yeah, but that's how we ended out of Auschwitz. And 2 days we were on the train for 2 days. Yeah, and we still got the same coffee with a piece of bread and watered down soup and all that. But 2 days later, we ended up in another railroad yard, and this was a station, a train, you know that. Yeah. So we were very happy to see, you know, and there was no more Auschwitz. So that was really something to when they opened the door, we went into this yard, and they were factories that the what do you call it? The rooms weren't as bad, because this time the barracks, right, wasn't that bad, because we had each individual beds, bunks. Think of it, we had bunks to move around and to turn around and all that. So we felt that it was a concentration camp, sure, and it had cable and wires, and there were guards still there, but it was different. That we could tell it was, because it was a concentration camp for people who worked there, and that's how we ended up working in a weaving factory. They had looms, and it had these nice. They showed us how to use it. These were German people that lived in Czechoslovakia, Freudenthal, Czechoslovakia, because they lived there. They had their own place and everything, but they showed us how to use the machines, you know, and we learned. Believe me, we learned. Something we knew that we're gonna do it, but at least we had a job. We were doing something, and that's how it happened. That was another 6 months. The food wasn't any better, believe me, not much better, but at least we no longer had to be afraid so much, you know. Then one day, we were working on the weaving machines. In walked these handsome young men. They were British prisoners of war. They also got shot down, you know, when they were bombing the places. And they walked in, and we just thought, my God, they are looking at them, you know. They did have the uniform on, you know. And one of the girls knew a little bit, so she said, these are British prisoners of war, they're flyers. Oh, we couldn't talk to them, we weren't allowed. We were not to go near them. But they used to get the Red Cross packages. They were allowed. See, the Nazis allowed them to have the Red Cross packages. So when they came in, they put things in our waste baskets, you know, a little bit of toothpaste just to brush the teeth, a little bit of chocolate, whatever, you know. It was such a wonderful feeling, you know, to see them. And that's how it went for another 6 months. 6 months later, we were still working, you know, and they used to come and get us. And we were in the factory working on the machines. Then one morning, we were waiting for these guys to come and get us. Nobody did. There were nobody came. And my sister, she was my older sister, I loved her so. She said, well, nobody's coming, let's go see, let's go into the yard and see what's happening. And we went into the yard. There were no more Nazis, no guards, nothing. But from quite a ways, did I say I watched? I saw soldiers coming towards us, towards our camp. As they came closer, again, this girl, she knew so well. She said, I think these are Russian soldiers. They had the Russian uniform on. And I said, my God, what are they doing here? They really came into our yard. They liberated us. They came and they looked at us, By then, my hair did grow back a little. So I wasn't that bad. I looked pretty damn good. And I looked at them, and they looked at me. I was already 16 then, And he picked me up. He picked me up, and his tears were streaming down his face, and he hugged me, and oh gosh, they didn't speak any Hungarian, so but we still understood what they meant, what they were, or who they were, and they truly liberated us. I felt very, very good to be able to finally be liberated, No, nobody can explain the feeling you get, when you don't have to worry anymore. You don't have to that somebody may come by and smack you or hit you, and oh my goodness, yeah. I'm going to survive this. And I did.